Welcome back. We are once again looking at Thomas Watson's A Body of Divinity, continuing to look through the covenant of grace today and zooming in since last time we looked at the covenant of grace kind of in a very broad way. Today we're going to zoom into the mediator of the covenant. And of course, the mediator of the covenant is Christ himself. Now, here's where we want to begin. Watson starts off and he talks about what a mediator is. He says this: mediator signifies a middle person, one that makes up the breach between two disagreeing parties. He reconciles us to God through his blood. Therefore, he is called the mediator of the new covenant. So they're the mediators, the go-between, the one who brings two disagreeing parties together. And this is a big emphasis in the book itself, where Watson writes of this. He says, there's no other way to, as he puts it, to make up the breach. There's no other way to, as he puts it in another place, of communion and intercourse or union and communion between God and man. There's no other way outside of the work of Jesus in bringing these two, and it's such an understatement, but these two disagreeing parties together. Yeah, we're disagreeing in the sense of sinful, rebellious man disagrees with a holy and righteous God. But Christ, he's the mediator, and this is where then Watson starts to talk about the person of Christ. So we get some really rich teaching on Christ, what we call Christology here, and he talks about the persons, the two natures in the one person of Jesus Christ. So here's basic, fundamental Christology, teaching of Christ 101. Okay, so this is really important, and even if you've learned this stuff before, you've had this stuff in the past, it's always really good to go back and, as a refresher, to really firm up your foundation. I know for me, it's always good. You can have as many classes and degrees and things as you want. Yeah, that's great. But you need to go back to some of these most important fundamental basics of biblical Christian doctrine, and he does it so well here. And so, as Watson looks at the two natures of Christ, he's very helpful in defining the boundaries. Right, the boundaries of right teaching, which is called orthodoxy, right teaching. He defines these by even using names of false teachings. So he says things like this: Valentinians deny his human nature. There's one of the two natures of Christ. Arians, Socinians, and Ebionites rob Christ of his divinity. There's his other nature, his God nature, his divine nature. Okay, so it's helpful to even know some of what these heresies are, because as you learn the heresies a little bit, you're learning some of the boundaries, right? The boundaries of right teaching. So you want to be very careful not to rob Christ of his full divinity, and you want to be careful not to rob him of his full humanity either. Then Watson talks about positively, okay, well, how do these two natures come together in one person? And that, I don't think he uses the term, but that's what we call the hypostatic union. The hypostatic union. That's the union of the two natures in the one person of Jesus Christ. And he says this, he says, Christ's manhood is united to the Godhead in an ineffable manner. So here Watson just acknowledges there's a limitation to human understanding when it comes to this profound mystery of how the divine and the human come together in the one person of Jesus Christ. But even though he says it's ineffable, he wants to say, yeah, but we have some boundaries, we have some limited understanding that the Bible gives us, and that, of course, Christian doctrine has helped to develop, not in the sense of making up new teachings, but in the sense of articulating what is already there in the scriptures. And so he says this, it's a really helpful thing. He says, okay, here's a boundary. He says the two natures come together in one person,
not by transmutation. What's that? You hear trans, change, mutation, right? Changing. He defines it this way. He says, it's the divine nature changing into the human. So that's not what happens. It's not that God changes into a human nature, or that the human is divinized and becomes divine. So that's not how the two natures come together in the one person of Christ. That's a no-no. All right. He also says it's not by mixture. So it's not as if the divine and the human mix together and make this third substance. Okay. The way that Watson puts it is, he says, it's not by mixture. The two natures mingled together as wine and water are mixed. So we don't have a sort of watered down divinity, a watered down God in Jesus. It makes me think of Hercules. All right, it makes me think of a god and a human come together. They have a baby, and it's sort of, and Hercules is this kind of watered down god. He's like he's a superhuman, a watered down god. That's kind of Hercules. Jesus isn't like that. Okay, he's not a watered down divinity or a sort of souped up human. That's not what Jesus is. So then Watson positively says it. He says, but rather here's what the hypostatic union is. Here's the two natures coming together in the one person of Christ. He says, but both natures of Christ remain distinct, okay, and yet make not two distinct persons, but one person. The human nature is not God and yet is with God, okay? So that's really the best you can get. There's two distinct natures. They remain distinct, and yet they're so closely united in the person of Jesus that we have one person, just one, all right? Now, there's more that could be said about that, but I think that's a helpful kind of introduction to it, and that's really all that Watson's wanting to do. He's wanting to give us an introduction. Now, there's this one point that I want to highlight here real quick. I'll just quote him. And I want to highlight this because this isn't something that often is emphasized in the Western tradition within the church. It's often emphasized in the Eastern tradition. I'd argue sometimes in an inappropriate way. But there's strengths, certainly, in the Eastern side of the church and how theology developed within the Eastern church. And I think it's kind of neat here because we get something that is found usually emphasized in the Eastern church, but it's being emphasized here in a Western theologian like the Puritan, Thomas Watson. So what does he say? Well, he says, and he, Jesus, took our flesh that he might, as Augustine says, ennoble our human nature with honor. So here's the African theologian, the great theologian who's been so influential across the church, Eastern and Western, and he's pointing to Augustine, and there's this idea, as Augustine says, that when Christ takes on human nature, he ennobles, he gives nobility, he gives dignity to the human nature. He honors the human nature. I don't know that we want to say all that much more than that, but just to say it's something that we don't often emphasize. But I think that it's important. It's part of our Christian heritage, and I think there's something to it. So again, this idea that when Christ takes on a human nature, that he gives honor to humanity. He gives honor and ennobles them. Well, then we move to from Christ's person to Christ's graces. Christ's graces. And Watson says there is a never-failing fullness of grace in Christ. And of course, this grace, these graces that are in Christ, this perfection of the graces of Christ. And what are some of the graces that could be mentioned here? Well, faith would be one, meekness, joy, goodness, right? Think of these kinds of things. There's a never-failing fullness of grace in Christ. And this grace, though, is not just to be held in the person of Christ, but Watson says is communicative. It's his grace for us, right? For you, for the Christian, for the believer. I can't help but think that maybe Watson here is going after Roman Catholicism a little bit, that there's a polemical edge to part of what he's saying here. And I say that because as you read him, he talks about this. He says, the saints have no grace to spare for others, but Christ diffuses his grace to others. Grace in Christ is as water in the spring. So he says, basically, don't try to go to other believers, to saints, in order to get extra grace from them. I think probably he has in mind here the Roman Catholic, or maybe he'd say the Papist, practice of seeking out the extra merit of ones like Mary, or those who have been sainted by the magisterium. I can't help but think that maybe there's something there, and so he's trying to dissuade people from that and to say, no, go directly to the source, go to the fountainhead, go to the spring of grace that is Christ. So there's that, and then we kind of wrap everything up here with just briefly looking at his 4 uses of this doctrine that Christ is the one mediator of the covenant of grace. The first use that he mentions is to admire the glory of this mediator. The second, look unto Jesus Christ alone for salvation, right? Don't go to the source. Don't go to other believers in order to receive grace and salvation. Number 3, see the dignity of believers in their closeness to God through this Jesus. We talked about that and how he's gleaning this from the Augustinian tradition. And then number 4, admire the love of Christ, our mediator. So there you have it. There is Watson's reflections on Christ the Mediator, his person, his graces, and I enjoyed reading this one. I'll commend it to you and say, be sure to go and read this little section. It's not long, but it's worth your time. We'll pick up there next time. We'll continue to walk through the covenant of grace, and I hope it's a benefit to you. We'll see you next time.